Hare Krishna. Okay, we're getting there. Hare Krishna, Krishna, Krishna. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna. Okay, yes. Thank you. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Jai Radha Madhava Kunja Bihare Radha Madhava Kunja Bihare Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihare Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Gopi Jana Ballava Giribaradhari Gopi Jana Ballava Giribaradhari Gopi Jana Ballava Giribaradhari Yashodanandana Vraja Janaranjana Udanandana Vraja Janaranjana Yashodanandana Vraja Janaranjana Sodanandana Vraja Janaranjana Yamunatira Vanachare Yamunatira Vanachare Yamunatira Vanachare Yamunatira Vanachare Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari, Jaya Radha Madhava, Kunja Bihari, Jaya Radha Madhava, Kunja Bihari, Jaya Radha Madhava, Kunja Bihari. Jai Prabhupada Jai, Prabhupada Jai, Prabhupada Jaya Prabhupada, Prabhupada, Prabhupada. Jai Prabhupada Jai, Prabhupada Jai, Prabhupada Jaya Prabhupada, Prabhupada, Prabhupada. Jayam Vishnupad Paramahans Parivrajacharya Status Srimad. His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada Ki. ISKCON's founder Acharya Srila Prabhupada Ki. Grantaraj Srimad Bhagavatam Ki. Shri Shri Radha Radhanath Ki. Shri Giri Govardhan Ki. Shri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu Ki. Sankirtan Yagya Ki. Gaur Premanande. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to Sri Guru and Sri Gauranga. All glories to Srila Prabhupada. Just take this. This will block the cameras. Okay. Hare Krishna. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Nama Om Vishnupade Krishna Prestaya Bhutale Srimati Bhaktivedanta Swaminiti Namane Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pracharne Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Pastyachadej Tarne Sri Krishna Chaitanya Pramanityananda Sri Advaita Gadadha Shivasati Gaura Bhaktivinoda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Vanchkapatarubhyascha kripa sindhubhyevacha. Patitanam pavanebhyo vaishnavebhyo namo namaha. Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. So devotees, welcome to our fourth session on Srimad Bhagavatam Overview Seminar. We are going on now to chapter 2. And last night, of course, we finished the first chapter and we went through all the questions. How many questions were there? 6. 6 questions were there. So, in the second chapter, Sutta Goswami begins answering the questions. Doesn't answer all of them, but he begins answering the questions. There are 6 sections in this second chapter. I'll just run through them quickly and briefly. First of all, verses 1 to 4 Sutta Goswami is offering his obeisances to his guru, Shukadev Goswami. Then he begins answering the questions, just sort of makes a little start. That's verses 1 to 4. Then 5 to 10, Sutta begins to describe the importance or the relevance of the sage's questions, because they're about Krishna. Therefore, they're relevant, extremely relevant. Usually, certain questions on certain subjects are only relevant to certain people. But these questions are relevant ultimately to all living entities, actually, but certainly to all human beings at the least, because they're about Krishna, and everyone needs to know about Krishna more than they need to know about anything at all. So he describes the relevance of the questions because they're about Krishna. Then he stresses the importance of self-realization, the process of self-realization, and the goal, which is devotional service to the Lord. That's verses 5 to 10. Then 11 to 15. Sutta explains further that since Krishna is the absolute truth, there is a need to satisfy him through devotional service. That's 11 to 15. Then next section is verse 16 to verse 22. And there the subject matter is that the gradual progression, the gradual development of devotional service, of Krishna consciousness through devotional service, as one gradually overcomes the modes and comes to the level of pure devotional service, and that coming to overcoming the modes, attaining pure devotional service, it happens basically through two means. One is proper hearing of Srimad Bhagavatam, and the other is service to the pure devotees, the person Bhagavats. Then the fifth section in chapter 2 is from verse 23 to verse 29. And there Sutta explains Krishna's position as beyond the modes, and therefore, because Krishna's beyond the modes, that means in the liberated position, people who want liberation should focus on him. That'll be the best way to achieve their goal. That's 23 to 29. And then the final section, sixth section, from verse 30 to 34. So the chapter ends with Sutta's description of how Krishna, even though he's transcendental to this world, he creates this world. First he creates it, then he maintains it. So those are the sections. Let's begin verses 1 to 4, offering obeisances and beginning to answer the questions. All right, so here we go. So it's chapters Divinity and Divine Service. And I could also just mention that there's a relationship there's definitely some relationship It's not exactly, well, you could say that it's like the second chapter of Bhagavad Gita. Second chapter of Bhagavad Gita, of course, is it's the summary. It's the summary of Bhagavad Gita, the introduction, all the different topics that are going to be presented through the book are introduced. Therefore, it's called Contents of the Gita Summarized, the second chapter of Bhagavad Gita. You know, of course, Srimad Bhagavatam is a much, much bigger book. Bhagavad Gita is 700 verses. Srimad Bhagavatam, it's at least, it's around 15,000. So, you know, you could say 20 times bigger. It's something like that. Yes, but still, the second chapter, it really does give very nice insights into what is the message, even the whole message of Srimad Bhagavatam from the beginning to the end of the process, from the beginning of devotional service when a person is just coming from material life right to the perfect stage. So that's an interesting point to note if you're, trying to study, approach it like a student and learn. Right-ho, so first section we said was verse 1 to verse 4. So we will read those 4 verses and then we'll come back, read them again, and go through one by one with some little comments. So, verse 1, Sri Vyasadeva said, Ugrashrava Sutta Goswami, the son of Romaharshana, being fully satisfied by the perfect questions of the Brahmins, thanked them and thus attempted to reply. So Sutta Goswami, Ugrashrava Sutta, is the son of Romaharshana Sutta. And as we said, there were 6 questions. We ran through them all at the end. What are the questions? Where do you find them? And where are the answers? All right, so verse 2. Srila Sutta Goswami said, let me offer my respectful obeisances unto that great sage, Shukadeva Goswami, who can enter the hearts of all. When he went away to take up the renounced order of life, sannyas, leaving home without undergoing reformation by the sacred thread or the ceremonies observed by the higher castes, his father, Vyasadeva, fearing separation from him, cried out, O my son, indeed, only the trees, which were absorbed in the same feelings of separation, echoed in response to the begrieved father. Well, as I said, we'll come back to each verse and just look at each verse in a little more detail in a moment. Verse 3. Let me offer my respectful obeisances unto him, Shuka, the spiritual master of all sages, the son of Vyasadeva, who out of his great compassion for those gross materialists who struggle to cross over the darkest regions of material existence, spoke this most confidential supplement to the cream of Vedic knowledge after having personally assimilated it by experience. So he's offering obeisances to Shukadeva in verses 2 and 3, obeisances, and verse 4. Before reciting this Srimad Bhagavatam, which is the very means of conquest, one should offer respectful obeisances unto the personality of Godhead Narayan, unto Narayan Rishi, the supermost human being, unto Mother Saraswati, the goddess of learning, and unto Srila Vyasadeva, the author. If you remember, those of you who were here last night, we came across one verse that we think we have met your goodness by the will of providence. Do you remember that? And and then you can be captain of the ship for crossing this ocean of Kali, of nescience. And we made the point that that verse is a verse which is sometimes recited at the beginning of classes. Many devotees, not all, but many, before giving a class, or as they're just starting to give a class, they recite some verses. So some recite that verse, and more frequently, more devotees, but not everyone, recite this verse. I'm sure you've heard it. Narayanam namaskritya naram chaiva narottamam devim saraswatim vyasam tato jayam udirayet. Before reciting the Srimad Bhagavatam, which is the very means of conquest, one should offer respectful obeisances unto the personality of Godhead Narayan, unto Narayan Rishi, the supermost human being, unto Mother Saraswati, the goddess of learning, and unto Srila Vyasadeva, the author. So this verse, it's an important verse. And like we said, some devotees recite it before they start a class. So, okay, let's go back through them again. Verse 1, Sri Vyasadeva said, Ugrashrava Sutta Goswami, the son of Romaharshana, being fully satisfied by the perfect questions of the Brahmins, thanked them and thus attempted to reply. So, it's a bit of a long story. We have many long stories, actually, in Krishna consciousness, but one of them is how the father, Romaharshana, died. If you know that story, he was killed by Lord Balaram, who poked him with a blade of grass. And that was it. Because, Krishna, because Romaharshana Sutta, even though he is a famous sage and knowledgeable person, he was in fact addressing a group of sages there. He was sitting on the Vyasasan. But then Lord Balaram walked in, and everyone offered their obeisances because they know this is Lord Balaram, Supreme Personality of Godhead, but not Romaharshana Sutta, because he was thinking, not exactly he was thinking, but he was thinking. But the thing is that when someone is on the Vyasasan presenting the message of Vyas, then strictly speaking, they don't need to get down to receive anyone. Those who are already, the audience, if someone important, prominent arrives, then they should bow down, offer respects, but the person on the Vyasasan can just, technically speaking, they don't need to. But when the person who comes in is the Supreme Personality of Godhead, then you better if you're on the Vyasa, you better get down and offer obeisances, you know. I mean, why would you not? What idea could you have which would convince you that the Supreme Lord can come in, but I don't need to offer respects? So Lord Balaram understood it like that. So he killed him with a blade of grass. You know, Lord Balaram could have just sort of, flicked him and he would have gone flying. But, one blade of grass, and that was the end. But then the question arose that, we're in the middle of a recitation here. And, we definitely can't just stop. So someone is going to have to take over. They accepted that actually what you did, Lord Balaram, was right, but still now we're perplexed. How are we going to carry on? Because we have to carry on. So then Lord Balaram had Ugrashrava Sutta. They're both, the father's Romaharshana Sutta. The son is Ugrashrava Sutta. So he had the son Ugrashrava Sutta sit on the Vyasasana and take over the recitation. So here, this is the same Ugrashrava Sutta who has arrived on the scene and has been questioned by the sages, who asked 6 questions. Verse 2, let me offer my respectful obeisances unto that great sage, Shukadev Goswami, who can enter the hearts of all. When he went away to take up the renounced order of life, sannyas, leaving home without undergoing reformation by the sacred thread or the ceremonies observed by the higher castes, his father, Vyasadeva, fearing separation from him, cried out, O my son, indeed only the trees, which were absorbed in the same feelings of separation, echoed in response to the bereaved father. It was last night, wasn't it, that we told this story? Shukadev within the womb, 16 years, last night, right? So anyway, this is the same thing. We already spoke about that. And so Sutta accepts Shukadev as his spiritual master. His spiritual master, or one of his spiritual masters, but let's just say as his spiritual master. So as we described last night, he eventually came out of the mother's womb, voluntarily, like deliberately, and immediately ran away. Without any, formalities, either of initiation, which is mentioned here, the sacred thread ceremony, or other ceremonies performed by the Brahmins or the higher castes, but particularly the Brahmins. And even without so much as saying hello or goodbye or anything, he just up and ran, and that was it. And Vyas was chasing behind him, and calling out to get him to stop. But Shukadev didn't stop. So we spoke about that, and we mentioned how Vyasadeva, the father, sent out some of his disciples. He gave them some Bhagavatam verses. Of course, all verses in the Bhagavatam are special, but some are more special than others. So there's a number of verses which are just really like just super special, really outstanding verses. And Vyasadeva told those disciples, just go wandering around the region, chanting these verses, don't stop. And sooner or later, you're likely to see a young, wild-looking, naked 16-year-old following you. When that happens, understand it's him. And don't stop chanting, but then you just turn around and come back here to the ashram. So that's what they did. And sure enough, Shukadev, who was just totally avaduta, no clothes, just wandering around, he heard the verses being chanted and was attracted and started approaching those disciples who, when they saw him, they understood, yes, this is him. So they turned around and just started walking back to Vyasadev's ashram and brought him back. And when they brought him back, Shukadev stayed and learnt Srimad Bhagavatam from Vyasadeva. So, he spent some time there. And when he had finished learning Srimad Bhagavatam, then he left again, and that was that. Yes, right. So, verse 3. So, again, he's offering his obeisances to Shukadev. Let me offer my respectful obeisances unto him, Shuka, the spiritual master of all sages, the son of Vyasadeva, who out of his great compassion for those gross materialists who struggle to cross over the darkest regions of material existence, who spoke this most confidential supplement to the cream of Vedic knowledge, after having personally assimilated it by experience. These points will come out more as we go on, even fairly in the next couple of weeks or so. But this Srimad Bhagavatam, spoken by Shukadev, is, well, stated here, the most confidential supplement to the cream. It's one thing to have cream, but then something which is a supplement to cream. Sure. Normally you think the cream is the cream, but this is the cream of the cream, something like that. Like when Prabhupada, the devotees in the manna, Bhaktivedanta manna, made halava for Srila Prabhupada, not using water, you normally use water, 2 parts water to 1 part butter, 1 part semolina, 1 part sugar. So, not using water. If you want to make a richer halava, use milk. Of course, you've got to stir it so it doesn't stick as it's heating. And if you want to make a really rich halava, use cream, not even milk, what to speak of water. And if you want to really go off the scale, but only if you're in England, get clotted cream. Clotted cream. Phew. So they made halava for Prabhupada with clotted cream. And Prabhupada took a few mouthfuls, and Prabhupada said, what is the secret weapon behind this halava? So now here, it's interesting, he's saying that the Bhagavatam is the supplement to the cream. So what's the cream then? This is better than the cream. So what is the cream? The cream is Vedanta Sutra or Brahma Sutras. Yeah, Vedanta Sutra, which had already been compiled by Vyasadeva. He had already compiled 18 Puranas. He'd already done, of course, the 4 Vedas and various Dharma Shastras like Ayurveda Shastra and various others, Manu Smriti. Then he did all 18 Puranas, and then he felt, okay, that's it. He did the histories also, Mahabharata, Ramayana. Then he did the Puranas. And then he finished the 18 Puranas, including a version of Srimad Bhagavatam. Or it's not called Srimad Bhagavatam, it's just called Bhagavat Purana, which Srimad Bhagavatam is sometimes called also. So he felt, okay, that's it. So let's summarize everything, conclude. And he wrote Vedanta Sutra. Vedanta, Veda means the Vedas, and Anta means the end. So the end of the Vedas. Vedanta Sutra in sutra form means very brief, little encapsulated in nutshell type concluding statements. So he compiled that, but then as we'll read, as we mentioned, we'll read in a couple of weeks or something like that, even though he had finished Vedanta Sutra, and as far as he was concerned, that was the end of his service of compiling Vedic knowledge, but he wasn't feeling satisfied. So then, as we'll read, Narada Muni, the spiritual master of Vyas, came and said, the problem is you haven't glorified Krishna enough. And told him he taught him actually a process of meditation through which Vyasadeva realized Srimad Bhagavatam. And then he felt satisfied. Right, verse 4. So now, really setting the scene and sort of like a stepping point to step into the text, right into the heart of the matter, before reciting the Srimad Bhagavatam, which is the very means of conquest. One should offer respectful obeisances unto the personality of Godhead Narayan, unto Narayan Rishi, the supermost human being, unto Mother Saraswati, the goddess of learning, and unto Srila Vyasadeva, the author. Yeah, well, there's a principle here. I mean, there's so much can be said, but there's a principle. The principle is gratitude, appreciation, and appreciation of one's good fortune, and gratitude for those who have facilitated or given you your good fortune. This is Krishna consciousness. Krishna consciousness, we mentioned the other day, Prabhupada said, there's no place for lazies or crazies. That's one thing. But there's also not really much of a place for ungrateful people, just kind of exploitive people who are just in it for themselves and they don't care. Yeah. So, therefore he's saying, before we begin, we should offer our obeisances to these people. We should acknowledge the good fortune that we have received from them. And which without them we would not have received, and we would be in a different situation, and not a good one either. Yeah, so this is very important. As one devotee said to us a while ago, Krishna consciousness is just so nice. It's so wonderful. We should just get into it and make the most of it. But we should never forget where we got it from. Yeah. Okay, so that's the first section. Then the second we said is from verse 5 to 10, which we'll read right now. And here in these verses, Krishna begins describing the relevance of the questions. They're all relevant. Why are they relevant? Well, first of all, because they're related to Krishna. Then he stresses the importance of self-realization and the process for it, and its goal, devotional service. So that's from verse 5 to verse 10. Let's read those verses. Verse 5. O sages, I've been justly questioned by you. Your questions are worthy because they relate to Lord Krishna and so are of relevance to the world's welfare. Only questions of this sort are capable of completely satisfying the self. We'll come back to this, of course, shortly. So now as we're reading through these verses, we're starting to come across some really important and amazing verses. And this one right here, verse 6, it's a bit of a super verse, this one. The supreme occupation, dharma, for all humanity is that by which men can attain to loving devotional service unto the transcendent Lord. Such devotional service must be unmotivated and uninterrupted to completely satisfy the self. Actually, it's a very famous verse. Savai pumso paro dharmo, yato bhaktir hokshaje, ahaitiki apratiyata yayatma suprasidati. We'll come back to it. And verse 7, this is another super verse. It's just really outstanding. By rendering devotional service unto the personality of Godhead Sri Krishna, one immediately acquires causeless knowledge and detachment from the world just by rendering service. You don't have to do anything else, become a strict renunciate or, learn a whole lot of things. You just render service. And now here's another one. This is just a super classic. The occupational activities a man performs according to his own position are only so much useless labor if they do not provoke attraction for the message of the personality of Godhead. So you name it, whatever it is, you name it. If it doesn't provoke attraction for the Lord, the message of the Lord, doesn't matter what it is. If it doesn't do that, it is useless labor. Total waste of time. And verse 9, and this is another important verse, maybe not quite on the level of the last couple we read, but maybe also. It's certainly around there. All occupational engagements are certainly meant for ultimate liberation. They should never be performed for material gain. Furthermore, according to sages, one who's engaged in the ultimate occupational service should never use material gain to cultivate sense gratification. Whatever material gain comes, or whatever any gain comes, should only be used in service. And verse 10. Verse 10. Yes. Life's desires should never be directed towards sense gratification. One should desire only a healthy life or self-preservation, since a human being is meant for inquiry about the absolute truth. Nothing else should be the goal of one's works. They're really to the point, aren't they? They're just totally focused. Just like you remember the second verse in the whole book. You remember that? Verse 2. Verse 2. Verse 2, just a sec. The translation, completely rejecting all religious activities which are materially motivated, this Bhagavad Purana propounds the highest truth, which is understandable by those devotees who are fully pure in heart. So it's like adamant, completely rejecting all religious activities which are materially motivated. Okay, so let's just go back through, beginning with verse 5, and we may not, well, anyway, let's see how we go. Right, so verse 5. O sages, I've been justly questioned by you. Your questions are worthy because they relate to Lord Krishna and so are of relevance to the world's welfare. Only questions of this sort are capable of completely satisfying the self. The point is made in Srimad Bhagavatam that life is full of questions and answers. Life is just full of questions and answers. And Prabhupada gives the example, one example he gives in that regard is the baby birds are, making their bird sounds, but what are they saying? They're saying to the mother, "Where's food? Where's food?" And the mother comes and says, "Here's food." So it's questions and answers. And Prabhupada makes the point that in business circles, the business people are questioning each other. Where's the good business? How much was this? How much did you pay for that? Would you like some of this? It's just questions and answers. So much exchange, particularly amongst humans, but not just amongst humans. But so much exchange is going on in the form of questions and answers. Loads and loads of questions and answers. Like, when are we going to use the temple room again? It's a question. There's an answer somewhere. Yeah. So, questions and answers. When are we going to start having programs? Not just ourselves. It's a question. I think the answer may be on Sunday or in 10 days or whatever it is. So, there's so many questions. What's the snack tonight? And the answer is no snack. Oh, well, but at least it's a question with an answer. Not a good answer, no, but at least it's an answer. So it's not an answer which is capable of completely satisfying the self. Unless you say, well, feast on the holy names then. Just do some extra rounds. Ah, that's nice. So, but otherwise, out of this multitude, absolute multitude, oh my gosh, of questions, those questions, like the 6 from the first chapter, those questions related to Krishna, they're actually capable of not just sort of satisfying the self, but completely satisfying the self, because they relate to Lord Krishna, either directly, who is Krishna, where is Krishna, or indirectly, how do we render service to Krishna? That's sort of a little indirect. So those questions and the good answers that come, they can completely satisfy the self. And verse 6, the supreme occupation, dharma, for all humanity is that by which men can attain to loving devotional service unto the transcendent Lord. Such devotional service must be unmotivated and uninterrupted to completely satisfy the self. So that's important, that, there's so many dharmas. Here, dharma is translated as occupation, occupational activity. So there's so many occupational activities. There's vast numbers of occupational activities. But the supreme one is the one which helps us attain to loving devotional service. That's the way it's being expressed here. Or you can just say loving devotional service. But here the way it's being put is that the best dharma is that through which you can take to devotional service. However, when you take to that devotional service, having attained to it by the other sort of preliminary activity, if it's there's devotional service and devotional service, if you know what I mean. I mean, in a sense, you can say not all devotional services are equal, in a sense, particularly in the sense that some devotees do more pure devotional service, some do less pure. And so there's a difference. They're both devotional service, but there are degrees of purity. So particularly, and this is really just about, would you say? Yeah, the first statement, or one of, if not the first, in which there's like a real statement of how you must do it. You don't just do it, but how you must do it if it's going to really work. Such devotional service must be unmotivated and uninterrupted to completely satisfy the self. If it's motivated, it means in a material sense, like, if I render this service, what are you going to give me? Particularly if it's something like, some material thing, or if there's an idea that if you're not going to give me, then I'm not going to do the service. Or, if I don't like what you're going to give me, I won't really get into doing the service. I may just go through the motions. But to really satisfy the self, to satisfy you, that devotional service has to be done simply to please the Lord, the recipient of the service. And for you, the performer, doesn't matter. You're just there to please. And, your experience, will it be like this? Will it be like that? That's not, should not, must not be a consideration if the service is going to really satisfy you. And uninterrupted also. Not that we just serve for a while and get distracted to something which isn't really Krishna conscious and then come back to the service. I mean, it's better than not coming back to the service at all, but still. You should really give heart and soul and make the service your priority. And now, what is it? Verse 7. By rendering devotional service means that sort of devotional service, unmotivated, uninterrupted. By rendering that sort of devotional service unto the Lord, one immediately acquires causeless knowledge and detachment from the world. That causeless means there's no material cause. It just sort of appears in your heart, in your mind. I mean, it's given by Krishna, of course. It's not literally just coming out of nowhere at all. It's mercy coming from Krishna. But in a material sense, it's causeless. Just like we know, I mean, the principle is mentioned in Bhagavad Gita, chapter 10, verse 10. What's chapter 10, verse 10? Well, who else knows? Tesham satata yuktanam bhajatam pratipurvakam dadami buddhiyogam tam yena mamupiyantite. To those who are constantly devoted to serving me with love, I give the understanding by which they can come to me. So Krishna gives to those who are really dedicated to serving. So that's the idea here. One acquires causeless knowledge, Krishna gives it, and detachment. You just lose interest. I think I mentioned the other day, did I? Anyway, it's an interesting little story. The one devotee who had been quite a meat eater prior to Krishna consciousness and had been involved in that with a friend, but then he became a devotee. Then he met the friend sometime later, and the friend said, "Oh, how did you give up eating meat?" And the devotee answered, "Well, I didn't exactly give up meat, but meat gave up me. I just found that there's just no interest at all. Just absolutely no interest. It just sort of dissolved and went away." So like that, by rendering that unmotivated, uninterrupted service, that detachment arises. And this is really, it's a good one. Verse 8. The occupational activities a man performs according to his own position are only so much useless labor if they do not provoke attraction for the message of the personality of Godhead. And we'll conclude in a moment. This is really quite a verse. In this verse, the last line is of the Sanskrit, Shrama, Eva, he, Kevalam. Shrama means useless labor. Eva means only or definitely. He means certainly. And Kevalam means completely. So the verse says, the translation says, the activities you do, like your duties, if they don't provoke attraction for Krishna, are only so much useless labor. But the way the verse puts it is, they're only certainly, completely useless labor. You get me? Only, certainly, completely useless labor. Oh, okay, I see. If they don't provoke attraction for the Lord. Yeah, it's really, you got to get the message. So we'll conclude here, and we will continue tomorrow with verse 9 and verse 10, the last two verses in this section. Any questions or comments, Marie, or anyone? Yes.
If you have an occupation, say
Teaching. If you have an occupation like teaching, yes.
It's not really devotional service, but with your salary you have some devotees.
So it's, you're teaching material knowledge, but you use the salary for Krishna conscious purposes. Is that okay? Does that count as devotional service? Well, if you use the fruits really in Krishna consciousness, then it's devotional service. There's an interesting exchange by letter between Prabhupada and Jayananda Prabhu, in which Jayananda writes to Prabhupada and says, Prabhupada, I am completely in Maya because I am just driving a taxi all day. I'm the temple president, but to get money for the temple, I drive a taxi. And I take, I drive to the restaurant so he can eat meat. Someone I drive to meet his girlfriend for some illicit sex life, etc., etc. So I'm just, I'm facilitating material life. I'm just in Maya, but I'm using the money for the temple. And Prabhupada wrote back, you are not in Maya. It is pure devotional service because you're using it strictly for the temple. So it depends how you really use it. If you use, a bit for Krishna consciousness and some for, satellite TV to watch something, then it's mixed. But if you really use it for Krishna consciousness, then, it's a type of devotional service. Hare Krishna. Srila Prabhupada ki jai.